Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Ina Fatkins. I'm a clinical psychologist and Associate Director of Counseling and Wellness at Wright State University in Ohio. So I traveled a little bit to be here, but it's my pleasure, and I hope that this rich panel will conclude the conference well. I hold doctorate degree in clinical psychology from Chicago School of Professional Psychology and master's degree in philosophy from SUNY Stony Brook University. And my passion is to connect philosophy and psychology. My work centers on in-depth Jungian psychology, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, multicultural psychology, and I'm passionate about supporting international students. So mostly I work with students, international students, first generation immigrants, and people exploring their gender, identity, and sexuality. The name of my presentation today is Living Beyond Binary, Non-Binary Narrative of Trauma and Resilience. The prerequisite of this essay became a political decision made in Ohio, which was known as Senate Bill 1, or Advanced Ohio Higher Education Act. So the bill bans DEI offices at public universities. In addition, this legislation regulates teaching diversity and inclusion topics, and Senate Bill 1 does not ban teaching diversity, but it regulates the content and asks professors to ensure that students are exposed to divergent and multiple viewpoints on issues such as diversity and inclusion, gender and sexuality, and the instructor is supposed to declare neutrality regarding controversial issues. And among other things, faculty strike was prohibited by this act as well. The immediate impact observed by myself and my colleagues was increase of grief, anxiety, and helplessness among many involved in higher education. In my clinical work with LGBTQ+ individuals, I have seen a heightened level of anxiety and growing difficulties with coping. Since the act took place only this summer, it is still too early to determine the long-term consequences it may have for non-binary individuals and the broader LGBTQ+ community. The pace of societal change today far exceeds the brain's natural capacity to process it. As a philosopher by training and clinical psychologist in present, I manage my own anxiety by turning to rational thought, seeking to theorize and work through discourses that are now in conflict. On the one side lies the essentialistic view grounded in traditional values that recognize only the binary categories such male and female. On the other, there is a postmodernism perspective that understands gender as fluid and dynamic. To grasp a current zeitgeist of educational policies in Ohio, it is essential to listen for both sides of the debate. So the question arises, can a productive synthesis be forged between the liberal or essentialist discourse and postmodernist discourse? The book of Helen Pluck-Rose and James Lindsay, Cynical Theories, provides a critique of identity politics, actually focusing on the problem of postmodernism and arguing that identity politics are direct and primal application of the discourse of postmodernism. The authors argue that postmodernism theory lacks any essence or substance and is primarily concerned with revealing hidden biases and unexamined relationship of power and knowledge. As an antidote to this way of thinking, they offer the idea of liberalism as it was defined during Enlightenment times. According to them, liberalism without identity politics offers a less conflictual way in accepting differences. They summarize approach as the following, and I quote, "Liberalism accept it with will always be fighting unjust and oppressive powers and mediating between different ideas. It is opposed not to conservatism in general, but to this kind of conservatism that seeks to conserve hierarchies of class, race, and gender. Postmodern movements also fight oppressive power systems too, but they have no faith in progress, and neither do they believe that we can continue to make progress by persisting in those things we do well and reforming that we do badly. Furthermore, liberalism respects people both as individuals, as a member of human race. It does not respect identity groups or collectives per se. It values individual and universal, human and humanity. One of the most heated debates regarding identity groups and identity politics is a debate about gender. So what is the foundation of the discourse of gender? According to Placross and Lindsay, the foundation lies in queer theory. According to them, with the focus on deconstructive techniques and its conception of knowledge, queer theory is the purest form of applied postmodernism. The word queer referred to anything that fall outside of binaries, such as male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. The researchers criticize queer theory for conflating biological argument about gender with chauvinist argument that reinforce the dominance of powerful groups, such as heterosexual men. They further contend that queer theory scrutinizes everyday speech, framing that what is perceived as normal is inherently embedded with racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. They claim that gender and sexuality are not social constructs. Rather, these categories have been framed as such because in this way it's easier to politicize them and mobilize social change. Placross and Lindsay argue that postmodernist theories conceptualize gender identity as a social construct, framing it primarily as a tool for political change rather than a concept that meets standard of scientific truth established by Enlightenment. They critique that they see as a profound moral relativism with sexuality studies and note that at times it exceeds controversial defenses of pedophilia and other non-acceptable practices. Furthermore, they highlight the tendency of queer theory to disregard scientific evidence when it contradicts its claims, although they do not provide any concrete examples of that. Placross and Lindsay also fault queer theory for dismantling stable categories such as woman. They specifically critique Judith Butler for characterizing people into genders and discussing that as a form of violence. They reject the notion that individuals who do not fit into traditional categories may indeed experience such categorization into genders as harmful. Violence of language and categorization is, however, an important notion in non-binary narratives. According to a member who discussed necropolitics, necropolitics is an exercise of sovereign power through the capacity to decide who may live and who must die. By controlling the language, rights, and conditions of existence, legislators and institutions effectively decide whose identities are deemed livable and who are exposed to marginalization, precarity, and slow form of social and psychological death. The framework of necropolitics also helps us to eliminate how non-binary lives are often relegated to deaf worlds through systemic erasure, social exclusion, and politics that restrict access to healthcare, education, and public recognition. Edelman, for example, applies necropolitics to exclusionary practices within the cities where visibility of trans feminine bodies of color, for example, in economically valuable space, is articulated as a threat to safety and the presence of criminality. So the very visibility of certain bodies considered as a threat. So also the writers, as I said, Placross and Lindsay, they criticize Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick for valuing plurality. You know, Epistemology of the Closet, it's a very good book. And so she values plurality, that is, accepting multiple perspectives simultaneously, even they are mutually contradictory. For Sedgwick, however, Contradictions themselves may hold political and personal value for people. Drawing on Jacques Derrida's discourse model, she challenges binary thinking more broadly, a stance that Placrosse and James find particularly frustrating. For Sedgwick, the symbolism of the closet is central in approaching non-binary identities. One is never entirely in or entirely out of closet, as disclosure varies depending on context, and some individuals may know their sexuality while others do not know it. She extends Derrida's emphasis on deconstruction to critique hierarchical positioning of heterosexuality over homosexuality, emphasizing that the very concept of heterosexuality relies on subordinated existence of homosexuality. Sedgwick also contrasts two perspectives on sexuality: the minoritizing view, which regards homosexuality as characteristic of only a small group of people, and at the same time, universalizing view, which conceives sexuality as a spectrum in which everybody has place. So everybody is on the spectrum of sexuality, some shape or form. And holding both of these views together, it's important, but it also creates paradox that, according to Placrosse and Lindsay, create unbearable complexity, which need to be erased. According to Derrida, as articulated in grammatology, the Enlightenment model of meaning-making contains inherent contradictions. Derrida argues that meaning is never fixed or fully present in itself, but continually produced through difference, the endless process of deferral and difference between signs. Similarly, for many non-binary individuals, the construction of identity through language becomes a central process, often preceding many biological changes, if they ever occur. Working through binaries, embedded linguistic categories toward individualized meaning-making can be understood as both poetic and also individuating process of identity formation. Another challenge to the idea of non-binary identity arises within psychoanalysis itself. The validity of transgender and non-binary identities has often been questioned and at times pathologized within psychoanalytic theory and practice. For instance, Jungian analyst Lisa Marciano uses the study of gender detransition to illustrate that her transgender female patient started testosterone and was on it for 2 years, but after that decided to detransition back to female. Marciano links gender confusion to unprocessed grief, trauma, and negative mother complex. She argued that this case of gender dysphoria was a split-off process related to handling trauma. According to Marciano, the patient's desire to transition had to do actually with anger and rebellious response toward her mother. And based on a single case, she challenges the idea of gender affirmative model of care. And her main argument is that this model treats gender identity as a medical fact instead of seeing it as a developing and changing intrapsychic metaphor. She discusses many examples of young people who had mastectomy and hysterectomy at age 20-21 and then regretted it later during the detransitioning period of time. She argues that affirmative care tends to concretize psychic pain and project it into the body. And she also claims that transgender narrative may be potentially a way to conceptualize the spirit actually and spiritual needs. According to her, transgender narrative may represent unconscious attempt to reach for divine, something that transcends a purely materialistic mode of being. The idea also echoed by other Jungian analysts who take a lot more supportive view of non-binary gender. In relation to Jungian discourse, I may bring up example of my own patient who transitioned from male to female and then later detransitioned back to male and consequently transitioned back to female again. Okay, this was a complex and interesting case, and it was a difficult process where detransitioning was attempt to achieving acceptance and validation from the partner that this patient had at that time. And therefore, in my case, unlike Marciano's case, detransitioning was a survival strategy, and transitioning back was a return to true self. So this just illustrates the complexity of individual journey into gender and gender identity. And another Jungian analyst, Naomi Artzel, argues that the very idea of gender binary might be considered so deadening and physically threatening for non-binary individuals. So she takes a lot more supportive stance on that. The idea of non-binary development is the idea of multiplicity and fluidity. Gender identity changes under multiple circumstances and often does not have a concrete and fixed goal. As damaging and controversial physical consequences of transitioning may be, they are often important steps to survival of the individual and reducing the harm. So Azriel warns analysts about potential countertransference and feeling destabilized, feeling confused and puzzled by, and even threatened by patient gender journey. She discussed that in our times, the disowned other manifests itself often in trans person, and most specifically in non-binary person, who confounds, complicates, and potentially, which is important, potentially liberates everybody's experience of their own gender and gender construct that they have about themselves. Azriel argues that non-binary gender search, and here this is a little bit of solidarity with Lisa Marciano. So non-binary gender search may have a function of divination, a transcendental function actually in a world where everything is mundane and secularized. And according to another analyst, Virginia Goldner, there is another way to look at adherence to traditional gender norms. If you look at from the other side, adherence to traditional gender norms can be seen as anxious self-regulation, obsessional defense, and border control operation. This perspective allows us to think of our lives as a constant attempts in passing and performer gender roles for society in order to accommodate others, which often happen in expense of our true selves. So I think it's a very interesting perspective on that. And conclusion, without conclusion, because there's no conclusion here, we live in the times of radical and dangerous splitting that is frequently escalated into violence and annihilation. According to Melanie Klein, splitting defines paranoid schizoid position in infant development. The nature of splitting has to do with unbearable anxiety, particularly fear of annihilation by persecutory objects. Following the ideas of liberalism declared in cynical theories, Flacross and Lindsay offer a so-called moderate liberal way in approaching academic subjects related to gender. They deny that dismantle categories of sex, gender, and sexuality, and deny that heteronormativity is oppressive. They contend that sexual minorities are also normal, and homophobia and transphobia are intentional acts that should be corrected. So they warn against the governmental control over educational process, like it happened in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban banned gender studies and all the classes rooted in postmodernist theory. However, Flacross and Lindsay critique reveal their underlying fear of postmodernist theories that remains kind of unprocessed here. They state it's important to defend people's right to hold postmodernist ideas and express them to whoever they want, to whoever want to hear them. However, it's also important to keep them from gaining institutional power. And yet, as we can see, the only way to prevent such ideas from gaining institutional power is by imposing institutional power of their opposite, approach that ultimately undermines the very principles of liberalism they claim to defend. So, young adults who constitute the population I work with tend to radically split in response to helplessness and fear of annihilation produced by big political narratives. Lack of synthesis and integration is unbearable to human psyche and is not sustainable in the long run. So it's essential to explore how the lived experience of non-binary young adults shapes their life, worldviews, and ways to cope while they are living within this conservative educational twist. Research in this area is not optional, it's essential. It must highlight that we are facing is not merely a debate over language or accusations of indoctrination, but a matter of policies that directly impact the existence, dignity, and survival of marginalized individuals. Despite appealing to essentialist arguments and so-called natural biological order, legislators implicitly recognize that those who control discourse and language also have power over human life itself. In this respect, their agenda is arguably more cynical than postmodernist deconstruction of reality, for it translates directly into poor health outcomes, heightened risk for suicide, social isolation, fear, trauma, paranoia. The language defining identity is stripped away, if that happens, the capacity of life itself is undermined. Thank you.